In Pokemon, each of the different types tends to have a specific way that they should be played. It isn't for every single Pokemon, but they generally have a few archetypes that they like to follow. In this video, I'm going to explore the archetypes of the Fairy and the Dragon typings, two types which are intrinsically linked. This video was brought to you by Aiden Tawney, who is a channel member and member of the Crustacean Association. Thank you for your support there, Aiden. The Dragon type has always felt a bit different from all of the other types, because it's meant to be the ultimate type in Pokemon. They're extremely rare, they're pretty much only available at the end of the game, and they're full of incredibly strong Pokemon. Competitively, I feel as though the Dragon type is kind of the opposite to the Bug type. If you watched my video where I talked about the Bug type and how the Bug type plays, I talked about how it was the de facto weak type of Pokemon, whereas Dragon to me is definitely the de facto strong type, it's the ultimate type. But they're also quite different in another way, and that is that in that video I talked about Bug being the move-based type. They have a lot of really powerful moves as opposed to really powerful Pokemon. And I think Dragon is kind of not the opposite of that, but takes that in a different direction in that they are the stat-based type, you know. Dragon types are often the best Pokemon in terms of base stat totals. They often rely a lot more on their stats because their stats are so good than most other typings. Dragon in this way are kind of the sheer power type, you know, they're just raw numbers, and it's a case of bigger numbers, better Pokemon. Many Dragon types have some of the highest base stats in the game, and this is what makes them good. They are incredibly powerful Pokemon, no gimmicks required. Of course, this isn't always 100% true, because some Pokemon might have really powerful stats, but just aren't up to scratch. Maybe their distribution isn't good enough, or they just lack other factors that would make them good or fit into a metagame. But to me, the trait that I would associate most with the Dragon type is that they are a type that is full of powerful Pokemon. The best way that I could explain this is look at a Pokemon like Skarmory. Skarmory does not have a very good base stat total, but it has a really good typing, which makes it a good Pokemon. If you took away Skarmory's great typing though, would it still be a great Pokemon? I would probably say no, because that steel typing does a lot of work for Skarmory. Whereas if you took a good Dragon type and took away its Dragon typing, I think it could get worse depending on the type that you're replacing it with, but I don't think it would completely break how the Pokemon plays. Dragon types are much less reliant on their typing because they have generally very good stats. Whilst I would say that is the number one thing I think about with Dragon types, I will say that they do have a pretty good defensive profile. Resisting all of these starter types is going to be helpful anyway, although I would definitely say that the water resistance is by far the best trait of these. Water types are incredibly common, and being able to resist them is a great trait because you can just spam water type moves all the time and they're probably going to be good most of the time, so being able to switch into those is a great thing for Dragon types to have. Dragon's good defensive typing also means that it goes quite well with other typings. I wouldn't, however, say that this makes Dragon a great type from the type chart perspective, and this is really because of their really bad offensive profile. The Dragon type has one good offensive interaction and two negative offensive interactions. And I don't think that the one good offensive interaction can really be counted as a good one, because you can't really be a counter if the type that you're countering is the type that you are also weak to, because obviously they have that circular, relationship with themselves. You're not going to have a situation where a Dragon type can always threaten out a Dragon type because, and I'm going to say Dragon type a lot here, a Dragon type will always be able to counter threaten out your Dragon type. So there's no situation where one of you is definitely on top. This means that Dragons don't have any defensive utility granted to them via their typing. There is nothing that Dragon type attacks can do that no other type can do. They don't excel at taking on any particular typing in the game. However, this is where that power typing that I talked about before came in, because while Dragon types aren't good at getting rid of any specific types, they can just deal with this because their moves are so powerful and their Pokemon are so strong that a neutral hit from a Dragon type is going to feel like a super effective hit. They are that strong that they kind of don't need to worry about being super effective they can just get over via numbers. Or at least it used to be like this. Before Generation 6, dragon types could be slowed, but they could not be stopped. Sure, you could send your steel type out and your steel type would be able to resist a dragon hit, but how long could they keep resisting hits if you have these absolutely really strong Pokemon just firing off massive attacks at you over and over again? Dragmag was the perfect example. It was specifically designed to get rid of the one counter to the dragon types and then just let your dragon types run loose. They don't need super effective damage in order to be good, just because at a certain point, big number goes up. But then as we all know, Fairy type got introduced specifically to make the dragon type weaker, and my god did they do an incredible job of making the dragon type weaker. If Fairy had just been given a resistance, I think that dragon would still be an incredibly strong type. They would still have that ability to power through a Fairy type, even though a Fairy type would be able to come in and threaten them. It would still be that case of how long can they keep doing that for. They're not going to be able to take massive Draco Meteors or massive Outrages for too long. But because Fairy is immune to the dragon type, there is no way that dragons can continue to do what they always did. There was physically no way that they could power through a Fairy type through dragon type moves and power alone. This puts the dragon type in a similar boat as Psychic and Electric, in which they're really good at dealing neutral damage and have some really strong attackers, but they are entirely, completely walled by a singular type. These three types are incredibly similar because they all want to play the same way. Get rid of your opponent's mega strong counters and then just run loose. I mean, both Dragon and Psychic have very viable spam sets that you can run, where this is the purpose of your team. Get rid of the counters and then just go ham. However, I think that the issue that the dragon type faces is that the type that completely counters them is one of the best types in the game. I mean, what do you guys think? To me, it's a toss-up between Fairy, Steel, and Water in which type is the best type in the game. I think they all have a variety of different reasons why they're the best type. I think Fairy and Water are consistently good types that work in most scenarios, whereas the Steel type is kind of just this all-encompassing defensive type, and I personally value good defensive utility far more than I do offensive utility. I think it's more important for a type, especially because defensive utility is specific to the Pokemon rather than offensive utility, which is obviously able to be spread across multiple different types with different moves. But let me know what you think about that, because to me it's a toss-up. But anyway, Fairy is definitely one of the best types in the game. I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but it is incredibly difficult to break down. So a dragon type is really going to struggle against a Fairy type. They are just a perfect counter to how the type has been built. Whilst Fairy is by far the greatest issue that the dragon type has to face, they also have to deal with that pretty bad ice weakness. Everybody knows that ice is one of the worst types in the game, but it's one of the best types for coverage. It has that amazing ability to hit a lot of really good types, so a lot of Pokemon run it as coverage. Ice Beam is an amazing move, and if you just look at the Pokemon who can learn it, a lot of Pokemon that aren't ice types can get it. Because it's such a good coverage option, dragon types are going to have to deal with it a lot. And it's kind of Pokemon specific, but a lot of dragon types do have 4 times weaknesses to ice. Think of all the Dragon Grounds or the Dragon Fly-ins. I think that this is why we don't see many good defensive dragon types, because they have some really common weaknesses that a lot of Pokemon are going to have access to, so they just wouldn't work that well as good defensive Pokemon. Or it could just be the fact that many of them are just offensively minded. I've talked a bit about how the dragon type now is a stat-based type rather than a typing-based type, but I would also say that they have a bit of a theming around very good moves, but in particular very good powerful moves. Both Outrage and Draco Meteor exemplify this in the most purest of forms. They are moves that are meant to be high risk, high reward, there to punch giant holes in teams. It fits really well with the bad offensive typing that they have, because a mediocre dragon move just would not cut it. You need that raw power. How many Pokemon do you see running Dragon Pulse or Dragon Claw? Most Pokemon just need that extra bit of power to get them over the line. Of course, both of these moves do have really, really bad downsides. Outrage has the issue that it locks you in and will confuse you after a few turns. This used to be a pretty decent trade-off, but now with the addition of fairy types, again, if you watch my last video, it feels weird to think that fairy types have been a part of Pokemon now for so long, whereas I still think of them as new. But now with the addition of fairy types, it's a move that's had a pretty drastic decline, because you don't want to be locked in and then a fairy type comes in and then you just look like an idiot and you're stuck there and like they're just going to Moonblast you, and why would you want that? So maybe in this scenario, Dragon Claw would be the better move. However, there is another alternative, which I'll talk about later on. However, Draco remains a very good move, even after getting weakened. It has very few counters, does very, very high damage, and combined with the good stats of the Pokemon using it, it just makes it a nuke of a move that you can just spam and just punch a giant hole in your opponent's team. But Dragon moves aren't entirely based around just dealing the most amount of damage as possible. You also have some moves that play not a supportive role, but a bit more of a slower role in a team. The two that I would think of are Scale Shot and Dragon Dance, which both increase the offensive ability of the Dragon type. In particular, I think that they increase the ability for Dragon types to utilize other offensive types. Dragon Dance in particular, because it gives you that power boost. Think about it, a lot of Dragon types don't actually use a main stab, or if they do, they might use a move like Scale Shot. Pokemon like Dragonite or Garchomp prefer this just because their other stabs are better, and they would rather be dealing super effective damage rather than Outrage, which, as we've said, has some issues with it. Overall, I would say that Dragon pretty neatly fits into the idea of it being the ultimate type in Pokemon. They have some of the strongest Pokemon in the game, they have some of the strongest moves in the game, but as a type, they are pretty flawed. Dragon types are at their best when they are punching holes in teams or sweeping through a team at the end of a game. It's a numbers game with them, and you just want to do as much damage as possible. I will make a little caveat, and that is that Dragon types have really good stats, but they're also quite well-rounded. Something I would say is similar to something like the Ground type. However, because the Dragon types have better stats, they're kind of more well-rounded. I don't know how to explain it. It's like a ball, but they're like a bigger ball. But because of this, they're able to fill in a few more roles than just big damage dealer, just because they have such a well-rounded stat spread. So you get Pokemon like Tank Chomp, who is the more defensive variant of Garchomp, who uses Garchomp's good defensive ability and its ability like Rough Skin to basically be a much more support-orientated Pokemon. So some Dragon types do have the ability to kind of break away from that mold, just because their stats are so good in every way that they can kind of be a bit more versatile. Going on to Dragon's number one enemy, well, the first thing I'm going to say about the Fairy type is that they are an incredibly good type. I talked about it briefly when talking about the Dragon types, but Fairies are incredibly difficult to counter. Good offensive poison types are really hard to come by just because poison as an attacking type is not that good. And while Steel does have some pretty decent Pokemon and some good offensive Pokemon, they're a type that doesn't come up very often in coverage. This makes Fairy types incredibly difficult to get rid of, just because it's so hard to hit them with super effective damage. You really have to go out your way to try and break through a Fairy type. They don't have that amazing defensive spread that Steel has, but they're just hard to counter. Fairy does have some very good defensive resistances though, including to two of the most common moves in the entire series, Knock Off and U-Turn. These moves are going to get thrown around all the time, so being able to switch into them really is an amazing thing for the Fairy types to have. You'll also have moves like Close Combat, which again is probably one of the most common moves in Pokemon, so resisting that is amazing. You can switch in on so many different Pokemon as a Fairy type, just because you have so many common moves that you can resist. That's not even mentioning the Dragon immunity, which of course is amazing. You're the number one counter to Dragon types now, so you basically have to have a Fairy type on your team, or else Dragon will run wild. If Fairy types weren't good enough defensively, they also typically have access to some really helpful utility moves or defensive moves. Most Fairy types have some form of healing available to them, and if they don't, they're able to perform a duty like being a cleric on a team. However, I think that the best move that they can have access to is Calm Mind. Calm Mind is not a fairy move, I know that, but fairy types make exceptional use of the move, far better than psychic types do. And this is because of their absolutely amazing defensive profile, which we just talked about. On a side note, when I look at Pokemon types, I prefer to look at the Pokemon themselves rather than the Pokemon moves, especially when you're talking about status moves, because most of the time they offer very few differences when used by their original type than when they are being used by a type that doesn't match that type. I say that most of the time this is the case because you do have some moves like Toxic which do act differently when they're used by the poison type. It isn't really the same with attacking moves, but especially for status moves, I feel as though those aren't very type specific. Calm Mind just makes the fairy type incredibly strong. If they weren't hard to break already, they are now impossible to break and they can just spiral out of control, and it works really well with the fairy type's decent offensive ability. Fairies hit 3 types for super effective: Dark, Fighting, and Dragon. I've already talked about their ability to counter the Dragon type, so I'm not going to go into it anymore here, but just know they're good. I would say that hitting Dark and Fighting is very good, just because these are some pretty common types within Pokemon. Fighting has had a bit of a resurgence recently with some very good fighting type Pokemon, and Dark has been a very good type for a while now due to the prevalence of powerful moves. Both these types do have a few other good counters, so I would say it's not the best of offensive profiles, but it definitely does a very good job. Fairy also has some very good move options, particularly Moonblast. Moonblast is an amazing main stab to have because it's one of the most powerful main stab options that you can get in the game. It means that even though there are a few decent resists of the fairy type, you're still going to be doing a decent amount of damage to them. Steel is one of these very good resists, but something you see a lot with fairy types is that the best of them have an ability to counter this. This could be through something like a ground type move or a fire type move. However, I will say that a lot of fairy types do struggle with having pretty weak coverage moves that cover steel. Some Pokemon do have to use moves like Mystical Fire or Aura Sphere just to deal with steel types. One area that fairy does have an issue with, however, is with physical moves. This is very similar to electric type. However, I don't think it's as bad as with electric type, just because electric seems to have a load of almost their moves. For fairy, the issue is more with variety, in that they only have one move which is widely available, which deals physical damage, and this is Play Rough. Play Rough is a very serviceable move. Would they appreciate another move? Absolutely. A lot of Pokemon can get by using Play Rough. Its accuracy is really the only thing that holds it back from being a very good main stab. With that main stab, you generally want something which is a little bit more consistent and will always hit. Another reason why this isn't super bad for the fairy type is that there generally tends to be less physical fairy type Pokemon. They're generally a lot more specially orientated. This is kind of similar to how I talked about in the fighting type video last time, in that they are much more physically orientated, so it doesn't really matter for them that they don't really have that many good special moves. If I was to summarize the fairy type, I would say that it's a type with no real weakness or a downside to it. They're very similar to water in that they will always do a job wherever they are used. They are just incredibly consistent and incredibly valuable to have on a team just because of all the things they can do rather than specific things that they can do. I know it won't feel like it to you, but I have just been talking there for 52 minutes. So I'm gonna have to call it there. If you have enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like or subscribing. Thank you.